Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. We are incredibly lucky to have today an author and a story that deserves a wide audience. We've all been more involved with the field of medicine with the pandemic in the past nearly 3 years. We take it for granted that the systems to help us are all in place, have been forever, and have charted a steady upward progress over the last century and a half. That turns out not to have been the case. We're incredibly fortunate to have with us today Kevin Hazzard, whose book about fellow pioneers at the Freedom House in Pittsburgh is titled American Sirens, the incredible story of the black men who became America's first paramedics. Kevin is a perfect author to written this because he has served in that position himself as a paramedic from 2004 to 2013, primarily at Grady Hospital in Atlanta, where he lives. He has been published in several books, and his stuff has appeared in print in prestigious journals all over the place. And he now writes for film and television with work produced by Hulu, CBS, ABC, and Universal. His journalism has been published in a number of venues, and he is a sought-after voice on emergency medicine. He lives in Atlanta. Thanks so much for being with us. Welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me.
How did the story come to you originally?
Well, I think it was 2018. I got this email. Somebody had read my first book, which was, this sort of crazy memoir about what it's like to be a paramedic in a big city EMS system. And they just said, "Hey, have you ever, do you know how this began? Have you ever heard of Freedom House?" And I had not. So I started researching, and, immediately you realize that nobody's really heard of this thing. The story has not gotten out. And so I just started digging.
Yeah, one of the things, that was surprising to me is, again, we think that things go a continuous upward path, that improvements get spread and then added on to in incremental fashion. But somebody took a huge step and then had it taken away from them. And this was less than 50 years ago.
Yeah, it's really, really remarkable. I mean, the history of EMS is like this crazy, sprawling snake of a story. But in its most recent incarnation, the nation had what was referred to by medical professionals as an epidemic of preventable traumatic deaths. And, this gets published in this paper. And so there's the suggestion out there that, hey, we need to do something, that we need to close the gap that presently exists from the space where someone falls ill or injured up until the moment they reach the hospital. There was no plan for how to bridge that gap, but people were acknowledging that it was there and that it was causing a lot of deaths. And one person sort of steps into that void, and his name is Peter Safar. Again, like he's a character whose life is worthy of a Russian novel. Genuinely, I mean, it was really hard to contain his story within the larger story. But, he's an Austrian-born anesthesiologist who narrowly escaped the Nazis in World War II and comes to the United States single-handedly, quite literally single-handedly, invents CPR through the series of studies in the 1950s, which nobody believed in and nobody was willing to support. And which he did completely on his own. And was this really audacious thing where he took these live volunteers, sedated and paralyzed them, and then it kept them alive with Boy Scouts who he had trained in this sort of 30-second crash course of rescue breathing. He takes all of his data from those studies and sort of releases it to the world and says, here's this thing, go ahead and use it as you will. And that's the sort of mind he has. And he arrives in Pittsburgh, 1960, 61, and recognizes immediately that this city has as bad an ambulance service as exists in the country. And, that study gets released saying how bad it is nationwide. So he knows that this is a larger problem. On a personal level, he's well aware of how big the problem is. His daughter died of an asthma attack, which, that particular death was quite preventable had she had some sort of care during transport, but that simply wasn't the case. So he knows what's at stake, and he just takes it upon himself. He draws up an 8-month paramedic course, which now, we think nothing of that. This idea of 8 months in the classroom followed by time in an ER, OR, ICU, the morgue, OB, all these things. But at the time, nobody had ever thought of anything like that. He modeled paramedic training after a doctor's training. and it's, hundreds of hours longer than what anybody else is doing. And he pairs that with a complete redesign of the ambulance. Up until that point, many cities, if your call for help is responded to by two undertakers and a hearse, so he sort of scraps the hearse and designs what we would today consider the modern ambulance. So he has this huge program. He just needs someone to run that program. And, because he was in Pittsburgh, across town, there's an organization called Freedom House, whose mandate was to provide job training opportunities for people living in the Hill District. And, the Hill District, you could shorthand it as Watts or Harlem or the South Side of Chicago. And, people living there most certainly were looking for the sort of inspiring opportunities that bring you up in life, that raise you to a higher stratum society. And they were having trouble finding that. And through this sort of, piece of good luck, the Freedom House, everyone at Freedom House meets Peter Safar. And in that meeting is born this revolution that forever changes how lives are saved throughout the world.
Yeah. You start with a class of 44. They're all black, all from the Hill District. Not everybody makes it through because it's an incredibly tough course. But those that do actually start saving lives on the streets. And they're facing huge amounts of prejudice and what do you call it? Turf wars. I mean, you've got the police who are and the doctors. The police are throwing people in the back of the ambulance as quick as possible because the standard there, get them to the hospital where people can treat them there rather than treat them where they are. It's insane.
It is nuts. They run their first calls in a violence that immediately follows the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So this is the world that essentially they're born into. And, nobody knows what this thing is. Nobody knows that this thing will work. And certainly, you mentioned that 44 guys start out, 24 finish. Well, part of the reason that only half make it through is not only is it an incredibly difficult course, but by design, these guys are ordinary by any measure. Safar has to prove that this thing can be replicated in city after city throughout the country. So you can't recruit these, super highly trained individuals with these immaculate backgrounds. You need to bring in ordinary people. And so not all of them, by design, are going to have the stamina and the ability to finish the program. He needs, to sort of draw his original medics from ordinary folks. And, within a couple of years, a study is done of critical patients transported by Freedom House, volunteer firefighters, and the cops. And what they find is that the police officers deliver the wrong care with critical patients, meaning when lives are on the line, 62% of the time. The volunteer firefighters deliver the wrong care 78% of the time, which is astounding. And Freedom House medics deliver the correct care 87% of the time. So, I mean, it is so obvious that it works, and it's this massively successful program. But you're right, like from day one, the fact that it becomes very quickly less about what they're doing in the ambulances than who's doing it. And they get pushback from the police force, who, has an acrimonious relationship with the Hill District. They get pushback from the city establishment, who, they kind of come up with a number of justifications for why they may or may not want this program to survive, and they talk about the financial viability. They talk about, is medicine something that can be practiced by ordinary people in the back of a moving vehicle? They actually get down to sort of the constitutionality of it from a local standpoint. Do we have the ability to do this? Like, is it legal for us to provide healthcare to our citizens? All these things come up. But ultimately, what it comes down to is people who are very quickly garnering attention around the country, who are being asked to attend symposiums of physicians around the world, and who are becoming the faces of a new brand of medicine, are Black men. And not everyone was excited about that fact.
Yeah. Plus, the doctors are pushing back because they think the only place to treat people is in a hospital.
Yeah.
And certainly, we spent $100,000 in 6 years getting our license. We don't want other people to be able to get in on our cool deal. So there's
Yeah.
multiple reasons for the opposition.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. I mean, well, the medical establishment, look, who am I to, punch, sucker punch doctors? But the medical establishment is certainly not something that's known for being, a lithe, fast moving body. They're they're reluctant to change, even though medicine is constantly, sort of lapping itself. It's the thing that Saffer experienced when he was inventing CPR. There were major questions about whether his methods would work. There were people who thought that expired air would contain so much carbon dioxide that you would kill people. They certainly didn't think that you could train ordinary people to do CPR. So this is going even farther, because you're talking about giving medications. You're talking about intubating people, which is putting a breathing tube down someone's throat, connecting them to a heart monitor, and then interpreting that heart monitor, making a diagnosis based on that interpretation, and then prescribing a treatment regimen based on the diagnosis. I mean, it's very, this is advanced care. This is what we're doing today, in an ambulance, not far from where anyone who's listened to this is sitting, is a paramedic who has access to narcotics, to heart medications, to respiratory medications, has the ability to shock people, has the ability to deliver babies,
Start
and
IVs.
do the whole and this was not happening prior to the introduction of the Freedom House paramedics. They were the first ones to trot out these innovations.
Which is amazing because, again, we tend to think of those of us who are baby boomers and born in the late 40s, early 50s, and we think that everything's always been perfect. Certainly hasn't been the case. And we're delighted that somebody is giving credit to these people. I want to cite John Moon, who is the through line that runs through the whole story that you've written. What an amazing guy he is, and the fact that in retirement he's still telling the story and spreading the news about this.
Yeah, he has certainly taken it upon himself to get the word out in any way he can, which is, of course, a big part of the reason that he spent so much time talking to me. If you speak to the people who did this, they will tell you that part of the reason that they initially decided to take this leap of faith and join this strange thing called paramedics was because they recognized in this weird thing, this new job that technically did not yet exist, a way for the world to take notice of them and for them to no longer be ignored. So there's a sad irony in how it ended. And so they're continuing to try to get the word out. But, John, he typifies in so many ways the story of Freedom House. He was born in an incredibly poor area of Atlanta that in the 1950s did not have running water or electricity, and wound up in an orphanage after his mother died, was adopted by a family in Pittsburgh. And then he grew up in the 60s. He grew up in watching the civil rights movement happen around him, which of course gave him this sense that, oh, things are changing and the world is going to be different. And then he graduates from high school and realizes nothing's changed. The same people who were in charge are in charge, and I'm still down here and they're up there, and I don't know how to change that. I don't know what to do about that. But because of the era in which he was raised, he can't simply accept it. And so he's poking around. He's sort of like, he's testing the defenses of the system that is sort of holding him where he is. And he's looking for the soft spot that he can sneak through. And then he finds it one night in a pair of Freedom House paramedics. He's working as an orderly in Montefiore Hospital, and into his wing one night walked two men with a radio on their hip that's sort of chattering this otherworldly voice into his ear. And he sees the patches, it says paramedic, and he doesn't know what that means. He sees Freedom House, doesn't know what that means, but he sees the way people respond to them, and he sees the way they carry themselves. And he certainly knows what that means. He intuitively, as anyone who's, been on the bottom does, he understands power dynamics, and he knows where he falls in them, and he knows where these guys fall. And he's stunned by that fact, by the fact that here are two black men who are seemingly in charge of a situation. And he in that moment, he says, okay, this is it. This is what I'm going to do with my life.
Right. And he's been an orderly doing bedpans and mopping up. And he sees, wait a minute, this is a way to go. And his story is fabulous. And I have to say, I've interviewed many, many authors, and I was absolutely blown away by your prose. You have a gift for describing things and for
Thank you.
putting it into work that is top drawer. Absolutely.
No, I appreciate that. I that's probably a product of being this weird kid who always sort of hung out. I was the kid who was sitting underneath the table at family get-togethers, dreaming some other world. And so I'm sort of a self-taught person at a lot of things. I just sort of, when I see something that interests me, I just start fiddling with it. And I think the fact that I never did any sort of formal studying, just sort of trying to figure out what I liked, or what made something fascinating. To me, it was always it was less, you know, how something was than so much in how something felt, or how it made me feel. And so that's kind of what moved me, is what's the emotion behind this thing, in the way that, my father and stepfather would look at a car, and they would hear that rattle, but they would know, oh, there's something behind that rattle that's causing this problem. I would read a sentence, or watch a scene and say, okay, I'm not enjoying this, but the reason I'm not enjoying it, I'll bet, is because I don't know what's back there. I don't know what's causing this thing. And so I just, sort of a self-taught person who's always looking for, what's the emotion behind this moment? Like, why is this person doing this thing?
Did it help you to connect with John and the other people you talked to because you had done it yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when anyone that I interviewed for this would describe running a call. I mean, I spent 10 years on an ambulance. You tell me you're brand new and you're working with a partner who has been around longer than you and who doubts you, and you get sent to a critical call, and that it's up 3 flights of stairs. And I know all the things that you're worrying about. I know what your partner thinks of you, from both ends of that equation. I know what the sirens sound like. I know what I know about that dump of adrenaline that sort of makes you feel chilly, and also the logistics involved of getting somebody up and down stairs and in and out of a house, and how difficult it is to practice medicine in that way. So when they would describe these things, I had been there, and I knew the feelings that they were feeling in those moments. And so it created a shorthand, I think, between us, and also a sense of trust. you know they knew I was one of them.
Yeah. Are you comfortable reading a section from the book?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I would.
Here once again was the maverick side of Saffir's energy and genius. He didn't simply want to prove that an advanced form of medicine could be practiced in the street. He wanted to show it could be copied in duplicate, triplicate, 1,000 times over in 1,000 other cities. And to do that, he'd first have to demonstrate that regular people with no medical training could be turned into professionals. You weren't going to get doctors and nurses to do this job. A century of fits and starts had already shown that. You had to create something new, something affordable, something that had been designed for this rather specific and peculiar purpose. To create the work, in other words, you first had to create the worker, the paramedic.
That is beautiful writing, and
Thank you.
it's kind of the whole concept of the book, at least one of the key aspects of it, and that's the reason that it stood out to me when I read it. And my wife said, "You got to get him to read that because it's magic stuff."
Thanks. Yeah, it's so much of that is that idea, this sort of ordinary people idea, and a lot of the story is part of what makes it so incredibly American. If you pick, what is Tom Hanks famous for? He's told 1,000 of these underdog stories of someone who, against the sort of ordinary Joe, who against all odds does something miraculous. Well, that's what this story is ordinary people who faced tremendous odds and yet did the unthinkable, and then did it repeatedly every day for 7 years. It's really incredible.
And we should tell people that they got shafted in the end, very basically. They got their funding defunded. The mayor, who I will not name because I don't want to give him any more, said we want to have, who had been against it from the beginning, fought it in every single way, finally said we're going to have our own service and we don't want to fund you anymore. And they ended up, some of them, joining that and being the junior person to people who had less training than they did. That's insane.
Yeah, it really is. it's sort of an echo of how things had been. There were a lot of complaints within the city in previous decades about hiring practices in the city's construction and steel industries, and there were guys who were protesting those, and who would say, hey, I've been doing this job for years, and a white guy will get hired off the street. I'll train him, and then as soon as his training's done, he becomes my supervisor. It just doesn't seem fair. And John has been on an ambulance and since 70. The original people have been on an ambulance since 68. Freedom House closes in 75. So that's anywhere from 7 to 5 years that they've been on an ambulance. And on day one, they are told to carry the bag and to be the third man on a 2-man crew that's made up of people who have spent hours, literally hours on an ambulance, and have absolutely no experience. I don't know that slap in the face is quite a strong enough term for how that must have felt. To know that they were the pioneers in this thing, to know that in the summer of 1975, a presidential commission of physicians had named them the national standard in paramedic training, for them to then turn around within a few months and find themselves on the bottom. I don't know that there's any word strong enough for how they felt in that moment.
No, absolutely not. And the fact that their leader Nancy, wrote the book that is still being used today in it. We sometimes are not really good to our pioneers here in this country, and particularly so if they happen to be minorities. And I really am delighted that you have written this book, and I hope it gets huge celebration, and that lots of people know the story because it's important. What's the response been so far?
It's been really, really incredible. You never know when you write something where you kind of poke holes in, a myth, which is, for people who are in this field, for a lot of Americans, generally speaking, paramedics began with Roy and Johnny in emergency, and that's a very happy myth. It's this thing that, a law was passed in California, and suddenly out come these guys sort of out of nowhere, and they're saving lives, and they're doing it in this very dashing, very American fashion. And to say, well, yes, that happened, but before that, they were a group of men who did this other thing, and who actually pioneered the work that would later be done in cities like Los Angeles and Miami and New York. But who were pushed aside. I wasn't sure how people were going to react to that, but the reaction's been fantastic. People from the field are, I've been asked to speak to EMT classes and EMS conferences. People have reached out to say how wonderful it is for them, to go through this history and to know more about this world, which to me, that's how it felt to me. As a paramedic, I wanted to know, who are my forebears? Where did I come from? What is this thing? How did we get here? And for people in the field to embrace it, for ordinary people to embrace it, for people from Pittsburgh to reach out and say, hey, I grew up in that neighborhood, or I grew up in a different part of Pittsburgh, and I never went to the Hill, and I didn't know anything about any of this, but it's so wonderful to know this piece of my city's history, which Pittsburgh has a fantastic history. And, thanks to Salk, has a fantastic medical history. I mean, it has, that vaccine for polio was this magnet for medical brains, and a lot has happened in that city, and this is a part of the tremendous things that have happened in that city, and should be celebrated as other advances are celebrated. And so people have really embraced it, and that has been that's been kind of a pleasant surprise, because I wasn't entirely certain, but it is a fantastic piece of history.
And it is. And as a working journalist, I have some indication of just how much research you had to do to get all the background. Because part of it is the story of the history of emergency medicine all the way back. And that's a couple of chapters that are just fascinating in themselves before we get to the actual crux of the story here. So well done. Absolutely well done.
Thank you.
Yeah. So when they cast the movie, what part are you going to play?
I will happily play a mutilated patient that's being, dragged out of a house fire or a car accident or something. They can, okay. I'll be one of those guys.
And I also want to sign out the fact that I love people who start the book with quotes, and you quote Gil Scott Heron, and I go back far enough to remember when his stuff was new, and the revolution will not be televised. And I thought that was a very appropriate quote for that.
Yeah, I mean, one, Safir releases his CPR data the same time that Sputnik is circling
Mm-hmm.
the Earth. And obviously, Gil Scott Heron talks about, going to the moon when we have all these problems here at home. And then, the idea that this thing happened and it was not noted, that this medical revolution took place and wasn't noticed, was another piece. But then it gets turned into the field, gets turned into this blockbuster television show that becomes seminal in the development of paramedics. And yet the revolution part of that thing is what wasn't televised. The results were televised, but how we got there wasn't told. And so there's so much wrapped up in that quote that I love that. There's so many ways that it connects to the story.
Yeah, and you also, again, it's an old DJ. Um, love the fact that you threw in a lot of, well, Wes Montgomery, Jackie
Yeah.
Wilson, James Brown, Marvin Gaye, Aretha Franklin. You mentioned all of them, but particularly Jackie Wilson and
Yeah.
Lonely Teardrops. Though for me, the Jackie Wilson song is "Take You Higher," and it just seems to add a little time stamp because music
Mhm.
will take us back to a particular place in time, and
Yeah.
I love that about your writing.
No, thank you. Yeah. John talks about practicing those dance moves by himself in a quiet room in the orphanage, listening to Lonely Teardrops and trying to do the Jackie Wilson splits. So
That's
you're
hardcore, man.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Music
is.
music does it to you. It brings you right there.
Yeah. So I should wrap this up by asking you a couple of questions. One is, where does it go from here? Is there more to say about this? Is there a second volume in the works? What's happening now?
I mean, this story, the people involved, I mentioned this Safir's life being like a Russian novel. He's not the only one. There are a lot of people whose lives are just too big for a single volume. I don't at this point have plans for another one, but Nancy Caroline, if anyone out there is listening and wants to dig into the extraordinary life of an unbelievable woman, who graduated high school early and went to Radcliffe before Harvard would accept women, and goes to medical school and gets accepted into this insanely difficult fellowship, and then you know does the does this EMS thing, and helps to create this, and then writes the textbook that people study for generations, and then moves to Israel and starts their national EMS program, starts a hospice program, spends years in East Africa as one of the MREF flying doctors, being the first on the ground following massacres and developing this food program, even though she has zero agricultural experience, but just sees a problem and attacks it. She's a fantastic character, a fantastic person.
I'm going to run out of my 40 minutes from Zoom, so I want to thank you so much. Our guest has Mr. Hazzard is the author of American Sirens, highest possible recommendations. Thank you so much for being with us today, and keep up the excellent work.
No, thank you. Honor was all over here.